I have learned that love is not a gentle thing that arrives in drawing rooms with calling cards and chaperones. Love is a fire that starts in the grease-stained hands of a man who should never have looked at me, and it burns through silk and propriety until there is nothing left but the raw, trembling truth of what we are willing to sacrifice. My name is Eleanor Ashford, and this is the story of how I destroyed everything I was raised to be, for a man the world said I could never have. I was 23 years old in the autumn of 1879, which meant I was already whispered about in ballrooms as something between a curiosity and a cautionary tale. The Ashford heiress, they called me, when they were being kind. The spinster princess, when they thought I could not hear. My father, Cornelius Ashford, had built his empire on iron and steam, laying rail lines across the north of England like a god stitching the earth together with silver thread. He was not a man who understood failure, and yet here I was, his only child, still unmarried after 5 London seasons, still refusing every suitor he paraded before me like prize horses at auction. It was not that I did not wish to love. I wished for it desperately, in the secret hours of the night when I lay in my canopied bed and listened to the distant whistle of trains passing through the valley below our estate. I wished for a love that would see me, truly see me, not the fortune my father had accumulated or the connections my name could provide. But every man who had ever courted me had looked at me with the same calculating gleam in his eyes, as though I were a ledger to be balanced rather than a woman to be cherished. There had been Lord Pemberton, who spent our entire courtship discussing railway stocks and the promising returns of northern investments. There had been Sir Reginald Blackwood, whose eyes wandered to the servants whenever he thought I was not watching. There had been the Honourable Frederick Cavendish, who told me on our 3rd meeting that he found intelligent women exhausting and hoped I would learn to curb my opinions after marriage. I had sent each of them away, one by one, watching my father's disappointment deepen with every rejection, feeling the walls of my gilded cage grow tighter with each passing year. My mother had died when I was 12, carried away by a fever that swept through the county one terrible winter. I barely remembered her now, just fragments of warmth and the scent of lavender, a soft voice singing lullabies in the dark. My father had never remarried. He had poured all his passion, all his fierce protective love into his railway empire and into me. But his love was a demanding thing. A love that required obedience and conformity and the gradual erasure of everything that made me who I was. I sometimes wondered what my mother would have thought of the woman I had become. Would she have been proud of my stubborn independence? Or would she have counseled submission, accommodation, the quiet compromises that women of our class were taught to make? I would never know. She was gone, and I was alone, trapped between a father who could not understand me and a world that did not want to. And then I met Daniel Hargrave, and everything changed. It was a Tuesday in September, the kind of grey English morning when the mist hangs low over the moors and the air smells of coal smoke and dying leaves. My father had insisted I accompany him to the Ashford Railway Works, the sprawling complex of brick buildings and iron sheds where his locomotives were born. He wanted me to understand the source of our wealth, he said. He wanted me to appreciate what I stood to inherit, to see with my own eyes the empire that would one day pass into my keeping, and, through marriage, into the hands of whatever husband he eventually chose for me. I did not tell him that I had already visited the works a dozen times in secret, slipping away from my governess as a girl to watch the great engines take shape, mesmerized by the thunder of hammers and the dance of sparks. There was something holy about creation, I had always thought. Something divine in the act of turning raw metal into motion, in the alchemy that transformed ore and fire into something that could move and breathe and carry human beings across vast distances at speeds that would have seemed like magic to our grandparents. The works were louder than I remembered, a symphony of clanging metal and hissing steam and shouting voices that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The foreman, a burly man named Henderson, with a face like weathered leather and hands scarred from decades of labor, led us through the main assembly hall, where a half-finished locomotive stood like a sleeping giant, its boiler gleaming dully in the gray light filtering through the high windows. Workers moved around it with practiced efficiency, their faces streaked with soot, their hands blackened with grease. They did not look up as we passed, too absorbed in their tasks to acknowledge the owner and his daughter walking among them like visitors to a foreign land. My father nodded approvingly at their labor, seeing only productivity, only profit. He pointed out various features of the engine, explaining the improvements they had made to the firebox design, the new alloy they were using for the drive wheels, the innovations that would make Ashford locomotives the fastest and most reliable on any railway in the kingdom. I nodded and smiled and made appropriate sounds of interest, but my attention had been captured by something else entirely. I saw a young man standing apart from the others, bent over a workbench covered with gears and springs and delicate brass components. He was not working on the locomotive. He was working on something smaller, something intricate, his fingers moving with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. His dark hair fell across his forehead, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle. There was a furrow of concentration between his brows, and his lips moved slightly as he worked, as though he were whispering secrets to the metal beneath his hands. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with a face that might have been carved from marble, if not for the warmth that suffused it, when he finally looked up and caught me staring. His eyes were the color of strong tea, a rich brown flecked with gold that seemed to catch the light from the windows and hold it, glowing. He had a straight nose and a firm jaw and a mouth that quirked slightly at the corners, as though he were perpetually on the verge of a smile. I should have looked away. A lady does not stare at workmen. A lady does not feel her heart stutter in her chest at the sight of a stranger's hands. But I could not look away, and neither, it seemed, could he. For a long moment we simply stood there, separated by 30 feet of factory floor and an unbridgeable chasm of class and circumstance, gazing at each other as though we had both recognized something fundamental, something that defied explanation or reason. "Who is that?" I asked the foreman, trying to keep my voice steady, praying that he would not notice the slight tremor in my words. Henderson glanced over, and something flickered across his face, a mixture of pride and wariness that I would later come to understand. "That is Daniel Hargrave, Miss Ashford, our finest precision mechanic. He maintains the most delicate components of the engines, the governors and gauges and pressure regulators. Brilliant with his hands, that one. Best I have ever seen, if I'm honest. Though he spends too much time on his own projects, if you ask me. Always tinkering with his gadgets when he should be focused on the work at hand." My father had already moved on, examining a set of drive wheels with the chief engineer, discussing tolerances and specifications in a language I did not fully understand. But I lingered, unable to tear myself away from the sight of Daniel Hargrave and his delicate work. "What projects?" I asked, keeping my voice casual, as though the answer meant nothing to me. Henderson shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both dismissal and grudging respect. "Automata, miss. Mechanical figures that move on their own. Clocks that do more than tell time. Little birds that sing, and dancers that waltz, and all manner of fanciful things. Not practical, mind you. Not useful in any way I can see. But he has a gift for it. There is no denying that. The lads say he could build a machine that would fool you into thinking it was alive if he had the time and the materials. Automata." The word echoed in my mind, conjuring images of the mechanical marvels I had read about in books and journals. The chess-playing Turk and the writing boy of Jacques Droz, creations that blurred the line between mechanism and magic. I had always been fascinated by such things, by the idea that human hands could craft something that mimicked life itself, that captured some essential spark of animation in brass and steel. I looked back at Daniel Hargrave, and I saw that he was still watching me, his work forgotten, his hand still on the workbench. There was something in his gaze that I had never seen in the eyes of any man who had ever courted me. He was not calculating my worth or measuring my connections. He was seeing me, just me. Eleanor, the woman who lingered in factory halls and stared at strangers and hungered for something she could not name. That was the beginning. The moment when everything that came after became inevitable, though I did not know it then. I returned to the works 3 days later, alone. I told myself it was curiosity, nothing more. I told myself I wanted to see the automata, to understand how such things were made. I told myself a dozen lies as my carriage rattled through the gates and I stepped out into the gray morning, pulling my cloak tight against the chill. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. I wanted to see him again. I wanted to stand near him and breathe the same air and discover whether the strange electricity I had felt at our first meeting had been real or merely the product of a lonely imagination. The foreman was surprised to see me, but he did not question my presence. I was the owner's daughter, after all. I could go where I pleased, see what I wished, and no one would dare to stop me. He offered to escort me through the facility, to explain the various processes and procedures, but I told him I preferred to explore on my own. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of a young lady wandering unaccompanied through a factory full of working men. But what could he say? I outranked him in every way that mattered in our rigid social hierarchy, and we both knew it. I found Daniel in the same place I had seen him before, bent over his workbench, oblivious to the chaos of the assembly hall around him. But this time, when I approached, he looked up immediately, as though he had sensed my presence, as though he had been waiting for me to return. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice was nothing like I had expected. It was low and warm, with the faint burr of a northern accent that spoke of humble origins, of coal mines and mill towns rather than manor houses and London clubs. There was no deference in his tone, no obsequious flattening of vowels to please his social betters. He spoke to me as an equal, and that simple fact felt like a revolution. "I did not think you would come back." I felt my cheeks flush, a heat spreading across my skin that had nothing to do with the warmth of the factory. "I wanted to see your work," I said, grasping for an excuse, any excuse that would explain my presence here. The foreman mentioned automata. I have always been fascinated by mechanical curiosities. A smile touched the corner of his mouth, slow and knowing, as though he could see right through my flimsy pretense. I felt something shift in my chest, some tectonic movement of the heart that I had never experienced before, a rearrangement of all the assumptions and expectations I had carried with me since childhood. He wiped his hands on a rag, a gesture so casual and unself-conscious that it made my throat tighten. "Very well," he said. "If you are truly interested, I will show you. But I warn you, Miss Ashford, it is not much. Just something I tinker with in my spare hours." He gestured for me to come closer, and I did, stepping into his space, crossing boundaries that I knew I should not cross. The workbench was covered with components I could not identify, gears and springs and tiny brass levers, each one precisely machined, each one gleaming with oil and possibility. But it was what lay at the center of the chaos that captured my attention. It was a bird. A nightingale, perhaps 2 inches tall, crafted from brass and copper with feathers etched so delicately into the metal that they seemed almost real. Each individual plume had been rendered with painstaking care, the barbs and barbules suggested by the finest of lines, catching the light in ways that made the metal seem soft, almost alive. The bird's eyes were tiny rubies, and its beak was slightly open, as though frozen in the moment before song. "May I?" I asked, reaching out my hand. Daniel nodded, and I picked up the bird, feeling the weight of it in my palm, the coolness of the metal against my skin. It was heavier than it looked, dense with hidden mechanisms, pregnant with potential. "There is a lever on the base," Daniel said, his voice quiet. "If you press it." I found the lever, a small brass tab almost invisible against the bird's pedestal, and pressed. The nightingale came to life. Its wings fluttered, tiny feathers fanning the air with movements so precise, so natural, that for a moment I forgot I was holding a machine. Its beak opened wider, and its tiny chest expanded, and from somewhere within its brass body came the sweetest, most haunting melody I had ever heard. It was not merely music, it was bird song, captured and crystallized, preserved in metal and spring and gear. The notes trilled and cascaded, rose and fell, each one perfect, each one achingly beautiful. I felt tears prick at my eyes, though I could not have explained why. Perhaps it was the beauty of the thing itself, this tiny miracle of engineering and artistry. Perhaps it was the knowledge that human hands, these hands, the hands of the man standing beside me, had created something so transcendent from nothing but base metal and imagination. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something I was only beginning to understand, a recognition that I had finally found what I had been searching for all my life without knowing it. "It is extraordinary," I whispered, when the song finally faded and the bird grew still in my palm. "How did you learn to make such things?" Daniel's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more complex, something that looked almost like pain. "My mother," he said, and his voice softened on the word, grew tender with memory. "She was a music box maker's daughter. Her father crafted them for wealthy families, little boxes that played Mozart and Handel when you lifted the lid. She used to take me to his workshop when I was small, before he died, and show me how the cylinders and combs worked, how you could capture music in metal and release it again whenever you wished." He paused, his eyes distant, lost in a past I could not see. "She used to tell me that every machine has a soul if you know how to give it one. She believed that the act of creation was sacred, that when we build something with our hands and our hearts, we breathe a piece of ourselves into it. She died when I was 12, the consumption, but I never stopped trying to prove her right." "I am sorry," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I am sorry for your loss." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw in his eyes something I had never seen in the eyes of any man who had ever courted me. He was not calculating my worth or measuring my connections. He was seeing me, just me, Eleanor, the woman who cried at the song of a mechanical bird. That was the beginning of our courtship, though I did not call it that, not even in the privacy of my own thoughts. To name it would have been to acknowledge its impossibility, to confront the 1,000 reasons why a railway baron's daughter could never love a factory mechanic, why such a love was doomed from its very inception. But I returned to the works again and again over the following weeks, always finding excuses, always pretending that my visits were about something other than the young man with the gentle hands and the warm brown eyes. I told my father I had developed an interest in engineering, a desire to understand the technical foundations of the fortune I would one day inherit. I told my governess, the formidable Miss Pratchett, that I was researching charitable works among the laboring classes, seeking ways to improve the conditions of the workers upon whom our prosperity depended. I told myself I was merely indulging a harmless curiosity, an intellectual fascination that would fade in time. But there was nothing harmless about what was growing between Daniel and me. Every conversation felt charged with unspoken meaning, weighted with significance that transcended the innocent words we exchanged. Every accidental brush of fingers sent electricity crackling through my veins. Every glance, every smile, every shared moment of laughter felt like a secret, a treasure hoarded against the cold demands of the world outside. I learned the story of his life in fragments, pieced together like the gears of his automata, each piece clicking into place to reveal a larger pattern. His father had been a coal miner, a man named Thomas Hargrave, who had worked the pits near Durham since he was 9 years old. He had died in a tunnel collapse when Daniel was 8, buried alive with 7 other men, while their families waited at the pithead for bodies that would never be recovered. Daniel still remembered the sound of his mother's scream when the foreman brought the news, a sound that had haunted his nightmares for years afterward. His mother, Mary, had taken in sewing and mending to keep them fed, working her fingers raw on the garments of wealthier women, squinting by candlelight until her eyes failed and she could barely see to thread a needle. She had been determined that Daniel would not follow his father into the mines, that he would have a better life, a safer life. She had saved every penny she could spare, hiding coins in a jar beneath the floorboards, until she had enough to apprentice him to a clockmaker in Newcastle. And then the consumption had come for her, as it came for so many in those cramped and airless tenements, and she had wasted away over the course of a single winter, coughing blood into handkerchiefs that Daniel washed and rewashed until the fabric fell apart in his hands. She had died on a February morning, with frost on the windows and her son holding her hand, and Daniel had been alone in the world at 12 years old, with nothing but his apprenticeship and his mother's faith in him to carry him forward. He had worked his way up through sheer talent and determination, mastering the clockmaker's trade and then transcending it, teaching himself principles of mechanics and engineering from borrowed books and discarded journals. He had come to Ashford Railway Works 3 years ago, drawn by the promise of steady wages and access to superior tools and materials, and he had quickly become indispensable, the only man in the entire facility who could calibrate the most delicate instruments, who could repair the most intricate mechanisms. But his true passion remained the automata, the mechanical marvels he created in his tiny rented room above a chandler's shop, working by candlelight after his shifts at the factory, pouring his genius into creations that the world would never see or appreciate. He showed me his sketches one afternoon, page after page of mechanical wonders. Clocks that could predict the weather by measuring barometric pressure, prosthetic limbs that moved like living flesh through systems of cables and pulleys, automata so lifelike they could pass for human in a dim room. You could change the world with these, I told him, flipping through the drawings with wonder blooming in my chest. You could be famous, rich, you could have anything you wanted. He smiled that sad, knowing smile of his, the one that made my heart ache with its weary wisdom. I am a workman's son, Eleanor. Men like me do not become famous or rich. Men like me are lucky if we are allowed to exist at all, if we can carve out some small corner of the world where we can live and work and dream without being crushed by those above us. The men who become famous and rich are men like your father, men born to power and privilege, men who know how to use others to build their fortunes. I hated the truth of his words. I hated the world that made them true. The rigid hierarchies and inherited advantages that determined a person's worth by the circumstances of their birth rather than the content of their character or the brilliance of their mind. But I loved him. God help me. I loved him more with every passing day, more with every conversation, more with every glimpse of the soul that burned so brightly behind his quiet exterior. I loved his gentleness and his strength, his humor and his melancholy, his dreams and his doubts. I loved the way he looked at me, as though I were a wonder he could not quite believe was real. I loved the way he listened when I spoke, really listened, as though my thoughts and opinions mattered, as though I were a person in my own right rather than merely an extension of my father's fortune. And I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that I would love him until the day I died, no matter what happened, no matter how impossible our situation was, no matter how much the world conspired to keep us apart. It was late October when we first kissed. The leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and the first frosts had begun to silver the grass each morning, and the world seemed poised on the edge of something, trembling with anticipation of the long winter to come. I had taken to meeting Daniel in a small storeroom at the back of the works, a dusty space filled with obsolete parts and forgotten machinery, where we could speak without being observed by the foreman or the other workers. That afternoon, he showed me his latest creation. It was a mechanical hand, articulated with such precision that each finger could move independently, could bend and straighten and grip with a strength that mimicked human muscle. He had designed it, he explained, for a veteran of the Crimean War, a man named Robert Ellsworth, who had lost his arm to a Russian cannonball at Sebastopol and had spent the 20 years since struggling to perform the simplest tasks, to button his coat or hold a fork or sign his own name. I met him at a public house near my lodgings, Daniel said, adjusting a tiny screw with a tool no larger than a needle. He was begging for coins, miss. This man who had fought for queen and country, who had sacrificed his limb defending our empire. And no one would give him the time of day. They walked past him as though he were invisible, as though his service and his suffering counted for nothing. So you decided to help him, I said. I decided to try. Daniel looked up at me, and there was a fire in his eyes, a passion that I had never seen before. It will give him back his dignity, Eleanor. It will let him work again, provide for himself, live as a man rather than a beggar. That is what I want my inventions to do. Not just entertain the wealthy, not just create pretty toys for people who already have everything. I want to help those who need it most. I want to build things that matter. I watched him work, watched his fingers move with such delicate precision, watched the furrow of concentration between his brows and the slight movement of his lips as he murmured to himself, and something in my heart simply broke open. A dam that I had not even known existed crumbled and gave way, and all the feelings I had been holding back came flooding through me in a torrent that left me breathless and trembling. I had spent my entire life surrounded by men who saw the world as something to be conquered and exploited, who measured everything in terms of profit and power, who accumulated wealth and influence without ever stopping to consider the human cost of their ambitions. My father was such a man, brilliant and driven and utterly ruthless. Lord Pemberton and Sir Reginald and all the other suitors who had paraded through my life had been such men, seeing in me only a means to an end, a stepping stone to greater fortune and status. And here was Daniel Hargrave, a man with nothing, a man who lived in a rented room and worked with his hands and would never own a railway or a manor house or anything of material value. And yet he was richer than any of them, richer in compassion and purpose and the simple, profound desire to make the world a better place. Daniel, I said, and my voice came out strange and thick, trembling with emotions I could no longer contain. He looked up, and whatever he saw in my face made him set down his tools and rise slowly to his feet. Eleanor, he said, and the sound of my Christian name on his lips was like a physical touch, like a hand pressed over my racing heart. We had never used each other's first names before. It was too intimate, too familiar, a boundary we had tacitly agreed not to cross. I should not, I whispered, though I was not sure what I was forbidding myself to do. We should not. I know, he said. But he was moving toward me, and I was moving toward him, and then his hands were cradling my face with such tenderness, such reverence, that I thought I might shatter into 1,000 pieces. His palms were rough with calluses, the hands of a working man, but they held me as though I were the most precious thing in the world, as though I were one of his automata, a delicate mechanism that required the gentlest touch. And then his lips were on mine, and the world tilted on its axis, and nothing would ever be the same again. That first kiss tasted of machine oil and possibility. It was clumsy and desperate and perfect. Two people who had been starving for connection, finally finding sustenance in each other. His mouth was warm and soft, and his fingers tangled in my hair, scattering pins across the dusty floor, and I pressed myself against him as though I could merge our bodies into one, as though I could somehow escape the cruel boundaries that separated us. When we finally broke apart, both of us trembling, I saw in Daniel's eyes a reflection of my own terrified joy. He looked as shattered as I felt, as undone, as though the kiss had cracked something open inside him that could never be closed again. "This is impossible," I said, the words coming out in a rush, tumbling over each other in their haste to be spoken. "You must know that. My father would never allow it. Society would never accept it. I am an heiress, and you are a mechanic, and there is no world in which we can be together." Daniel took my hands in his, and his grip was warm and steady, an anchor in the storm of my panic. "I know what I am, Eleanor. I know what you are. I have known from the first moment I saw you that loving you would be the ruin of me. I have fought it. God knows I have fought it. I have told myself 1,000 times that I have no right to want you, no right to dream of you, no right to imagine a future that can never exist." "Then why?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why did you let this happen?" "Because I cannot seem to stop." He raised my hands to his lips, pressed a kiss to my knuckles, and the tenderness of the gesture made tears spill down my cheeks. "Because every time I see you, every time I hear your voice, every time you look at me with those eyes that see past everything I am supposed to be and find the man underneath, I fall deeper. I have no armor against you, Eleanor. I have no defenses. You have conquered me utterly, and I do not even want to resist anymore." I pressed my forehead to his, breathing in the scent of him, metal and soap and something ineffably his own, something that would forever after mean safety and home and love to me. "Then we are ruined together," I said, "because I cannot stop either. I do not want to stop. I would rather be ruined with you than safe with anyone else." He kissed me again then, slower this time, deeper, a kiss that felt like a vow, a promise, a declaration of war against everything that stood between us. And when we finally separated, our breath mingling in the cold air of the storeroom, I knew that my life had been divided into 2 parts, before this moment and after, and that nothing in the world could ever make me regret the choice I had made. We were careful after that, so careful. We met in secret, in the dusty storeroom, in the shadow of half-built engines, in a small park near the works where the trees grew thick enough to hide us from prying eyes. We spoke of everything and nothing, of his dreams and my fears, of the automata he would build and the world that would never let us be. We stole kisses in dark corners and held hands beneath tables and learned each other's bodies in slow, secret increments, mapping territories that we knew might be taken from us at any moment. I learned that he had a birthmark on his left shoulder blade, shaped like a crescent moon. I learned that he laughed in his sleep sometimes, soft chuckles that made my heart swell with tenderness. I learned that he dreamed of building a workshop of his own someday, a place where he could create his automata without the constraints of factory labor, where he could teach other young men and women from backgrounds like his own, giving them the opportunities that had been so hard for him to find. He learned that I was afraid of thunderstorms, a childish fear left over from a night when I was 7 and lightning had struck the great oak outside my window, splitting it in 2 with a sound like the world ending. He learned that I secretly wrote poetry, terrible verses that I hid in a locked drawer in my desk, too ashamed of their inadequacy to show them to anyone. He learned that I had always wanted to travel, to see the pyramids of Egypt and the temples of Greece and all the wonders of the world that I had only ever read about in books. We built a life in those stolen moments, a secret world that existed only for the 2 of us, a fragile bubble of happiness that we both knew could not last. Winter came early that year, with snow falling thick and silent over the moors and ice glazing the windows of Ashford Hall. My father began to notice my distraction, my reluctance to attend the endless rounds of dinners and balls that made up the social season. He commented on my color, the bloom that had come into my cheeks, the light that had begun to shine in my eyes. He assumed it was the result of my new interest in engineering, my engagement with the practical workings of his empire, and he was pleased. But he was also growing impatient with my continued resistance to marriage. He had a new suitor in mind, he informed me one frigid December evening as we sat in the drawing room after dinner, the fire crackling in the grate and the wind howling outside the frosted windows. "Lord Marcus Whitmore," he said, swirling brandy in his glass, watching me over the rim with those calculating eyes that missed nothing. the second son of the Earl of Dunmore. A fine match, Eleanor. Excellent connections to the peerage. Old family, impeccable breeding. He has expressed considerable interest in making your acquaintance. I felt the blood drain from my face, felt the warmth that Daniel's love had kindled inside me flicker and grow cold. I had met Lord Whitmore at several functions over the years and had always found him repellent. He was handsome enough, I supposed, in the cold, classical way of Greek statues, with pale blonde hair and eyes the color of winter ice, and features so perfectly symmetrical they seemed almost inhuman. But there was something cruel in the set of his mouth, something predatory in his gaze that made my skin crawl whenever he looked at me. Rumor had it that he had run through his own inheritance in gambling debts, that he had lost a fortune at the tables of London's most exclusive clubs, that he was now desperately seeking a wealthy wife to restore his finances. There were darker rumors, too, whispers about servants who had left his household abruptly, about a maid who had been found weeping in the servants' quarters with bruises on her arms, about a young woman from the village near his estate who had disappeared one night and never been seen again. I told my father I was not interested. I told him I had no wish to meet Lord Whitmore, no desire to entertain his suit, no intention of marrying a man I did not love simply to satisfy the demands of society and family duty. He told me I did not have a choice. "I will not marry him," I said, my voice shaking with rage and fear and the desperate knowledge that I was fighting a battle I could not win. "I will not marry anyone I do not love." My father's face hardened into the expression I knew so well, the expression that had crushed competitors and broken rivals and built an empire out of iron and will. He set down his brandy glass with a deliberate click that sounded like the closing of a cage door. "Love," he said, and the word dripped from his lips like poison. "Love is a luxury you cannot afford, Eleanor. You are my daughter, my only heir, and your marriage is not a matter of sentiment but of strategy. Lord Whitmore offers us entry into the aristocracy, connections that will protect and expand everything I have built. You will meet with him. You will be charming and accommodating. And when he proposes, as he certainly will, you will accept. And if I refuse?" His eyes went flat and cold, the eyes of a man who had destroyed countless opponents on his rise to power. "If you refuse, you will find yourself with nothing. No inheritance, no allowance, no home, no name. I will disown you utterly, Eleanor. I will cut you off without a penny, and you will discover exactly how kind the world is to women without resources or protection. You will learn what it means to be alone, truly alone, without family or fortune to shield you from the cruelties of existence." I fled to my room and wept until I had no tears left, until my eyes burned and my throat ached and my pillow was soaked with the salt of my despair. I understood then, with terrible clarity, that my father did not see me as a daughter to be loved, but as an asset to be deployed, a piece on the chessboard of his ambitions to be moved and sacrificed as strategy demanded. I also understood that I could not, would not, must not give in. Not when Daniel existed. Not when I knew what love truly felt like, how it filled the empty spaces inside me, how it gave my life meaning and purpose beyond the hollow rituals of wealth and status. I would rather be poor and free than rich, and trapped in a loveless marriage to a man who made my flesh crawl. The next morning, I went to Daniel. He listened in silence as I told him everything, his face growing paler with each word, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. When I finished, he turned away from me and stood at the frost-rimed window of the storeroom, staring out at the gray sky, his shoulders taut with tension. "You should marry him," he said at last, and his voice was hollow, emptied of all the warmth I had come to love. "You should marry Lord Whitmore and forget you ever knew me." I felt as though he had struck me, as though he had reached into my chest and torn something vital from its moorings. "How can you say that?" I demanded, my voice rising with anguish. "After everything we have shared? After everything we have meant to each other? Because I love you. He turned back to me, and I saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears, glittering like the frost on the window behind him. Because I love you more than I have ever loved anything or anyone, and I cannot give you anything, Eleanor. I have nothing to offer but a rented room and a handful of gears. I have no money, no connections, no power. Your father is right. The world would destroy you if you chose me. Society would shun you. Your friends would abandon you. You would lose everything you have ever known, everything that makes your life comfortable and safe. I crossed the room in 3 steps and took his face in my hands, the way he had taken mine the first time he kissed me. His cheeks were rough with stubble, and tears were sliding down them now, wetting my palms. And I had never loved him more than I did in that moment of his beautiful, selfless, utterly misguided nobility. "Listen to me, Daniel Hargrave," I said, and my voice was fierce with conviction. "I do not want Lord Whitmore's title or my father's money. I do not want ballrooms and carriages and the approval of society. I do not want a life of comfort if it means a life without love, without passion, without you. Do you understand me? I would rather live in your rented room and eat nothing but bread and cheese for the rest of my days than spend a single night in Lord Whitmore's bed." He closed his eyes, and a sob escaped him, a sound so raw and broken that it shattered what remained of my composure. I pulled him close, wrapped my arms around him, held him as he trembled against me. "You cannot mean that," he whispered against my hair. "You cannot possibly mean that. I have never meant anything more in my life." I pulled back to look at him, to make sure he could see the truth in my eyes. "I want you, Daniel. Only you. If you send me away, I will go, but I need you to know that I will never love anyone else. Never. Not if I live to be 100. You are my heart. You are my home. And I will fight anyone, sacrifice anything, defy any power on earth to be with you." He kissed me then, a kiss that tasted of tears and desperation and the fierce, defiant hope of 2 people who refused to accept the impossible. And when we finally broke apart, foreheads pressed together, breath mingling in the cold air, I saw in his eyes a resolve that matched my own. "Then we will find a way," he whispered. "Somehow. Together. We will find a way." I believed him. I was a fool to believe him, perhaps. But I was young and in love, and I did not yet understand how ruthless the world could be to those who dared to want what they were not supposed to have. The new year came and went, and the snows began to melt, and I continued my secret meetings with Daniel while evading my father's increasingly insistent demands that I accept Lord Whitmore's courtship. I had become skilled at deception, at smiling and nodding and saying all the right things, while my heart was elsewhere, always in that dusty storeroom, always with the dark-haired mechanic who had taught me what it meant to be truly seen and truly loved. Lord Whitmore came to dinner at Ashford Hall in late January, and I forced myself to be civil to him, to make polite conversation and laugh at his jokes, and pretend that his proximity did not make my stomach churn with revulsion. He was charming in his way, smooth and polished and impeccably mannered, but beneath the veneer of aristocratic courtesy, I sensed something cold and calculating, something that watched me with a predator's patience, waiting for the moment to strike. He complimented my beauty and my wit. He expressed admiration for my father's achievements and interest in the workings of the railway. He told amusing anecdotes about London society and dropped names that were meant to impress me with his connections to the great and powerful. But when he looked at me, his pale eyes traveled over my body with a possessiveness that made my skin prickle, as though he were already mentally cataloging his future property. After dinner, when the men retired to the smoking room and I was left alone in the drawing room with my needlework, the butler brought me a note on a silver tray. It was from Lord Whitmore, written in an elegant copperplate hand, requesting the honor of a private audience with me the following day. I burned the note in the fireplace and told the butler to inform his lordship that I was indisposed, But someone was watching. Someone had been watching for weeks, perhaps months, gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for the right moment to reveal what they knew. And in late February, that moment came. I do not know how they discovered our secret. Perhaps a servant had followed me on one of my visits to the works and reported back to my father. Perhaps one of the other workers had noticed Daniel's distraction, his habit of disappearing for hours at a time, and had grown suspicious enough to investigate. Perhaps Lord Whitmore himself, sensing my resistance, had hired someone to look into my activities and uncover the reason for my reluctance. All I know is that one gray February afternoon, my father summoned me to his study, with a face like a thundercloud, and told me that he knew everything. I will not describe the conversation that followed in detail. Even now, all these years later, the memory of his words cuts like broken glass, leaves wounds that have never fully healed. He called me a disgrace, a fool, a harlot who had thrown away her virtue and her future on a common laborer, a nobody, a man so far beneath her station that their association was not merely inappropriate, but obscene. He told me that I had shamed the Ashford name beyond redemption, that I had destroyed everything he had built, that I was no longer his daughter in any way that mattered. He told me that he had sacrificed everything for me, had worked and fought and schemed for decades to give me a life of privilege and opportunity, and that I had repaid him by crawling into the bed of a factory worker like a common trollop. And then he told me what he planned to do. Lord Whitmore, it seemed, had been informed of my indiscretion, but he was willing to overlook it, willing to marry me anyway, in exchange for certain financial considerations from my father, a substantial settlement, a guarantee of investment in Whitmore's struggling estates, the promise that my disgrace would be buried and forgotten, that society would never learn of my fall from grace. The wedding would take place in April. I would retire to Whitmore's country estate immediately afterward and never return to the north. And as for Daniel Hargrave, well, he would be dealt with. Dealt with? I repeated, my blood running cold. What do you mean, dealt with? My father smiled, and it was the most terrible thing I had ever seen, a smile without warmth or humanity, the smile of a man who had become so accustomed to destroying his enemies that he no longer even thought of them as people. You do not need to concern yourself with the details, he said. Suffice it to say that your little mechanic will regret the day he dared to lay his hands on an Ashford. He will regret the day he was born if I have anything to say about it. I begged, I pleaded, I threw myself at his feet and wept and promised to marry Lord Whitmore willingly, eagerly, gratefully, if only he would leave Daniel alone. I would never see him again, I swore. I would never speak his name or think of him or do anything that might remind my father of the shame I had brought upon our family. I would be the perfect wife, the perfect daughter, the perfect ornament to the Ashford dynasty. I would give Lord Whitmore heirs and manage his household and smile and nod and pretend that my heart was not breaking into 1,000 pieces. Anything at all. Just please, please, do not hurt Daniel. But my father was beyond reason, beyond mercy. He had been humiliated. His pride had been wounded. And someone would pay for that wound, whether I cooperated or not. I was confined to my room. Guards were posted at my door, 2 of my father's most trusted footmen, men who had served our family for years and would not be swayed by any appeal I might make. My correspondence was seized, my writing materials taken away. I was allowed no visitors, permitted no communication with the outside world. I was a prisoner in my own home, trapped in a gilded cage while the man I loved walked unknowing toward a trap that would destroy him. Days passed. A week. The walls of my chamber seemed to close in around me, and I thought I would go mad with fear and helplessness. I paced the floor until my feet ached. I pressed my face to the window and stared out at the grounds, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of what was happening beyond the walls of my prison. I dreamed of Daniel every night, terrible dreams in which I watched him suffer while I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to help. I knew my father was planning something, but I did not know what. I knew Lord Whitmore was involved, but I did not know how. All I could do was wait and pray and hope that somehow, Daniel would escape whatever fate they had designed for him. It was my maid, Polly, who finally brought me the truth. She was a timid girl, barely 17, with red hair and freckles and a nervous habit of twisting her apron between her fingers whenever she was anxious. She had served me since I was 14, had brushed my hair and helped me dress and kept my secrets with a loyalty that had never wavered. She had no reason to risk my father's wrath by helping me, no reason to jeopardize her position and her livelihood for a mistress who had been declared a disgrace. But she did it anyway, because she had seen the way I looked at Daniel, and because she was a romantic at heart, and because she believed, as I did, that love was worth fighting for. She came to me late one night, slipping into my room through the servants' entrance while the footmen dozed at their posts, carrying a candle that trembled in her hand and news that turned my blood to ice. "Miss," she whispered, her face white with fear, "I heard them talking. Your father and Lord Whitmore. They were in the study after dinner, and I was cleaning the hall outside, and I heard everything. They are setting a trap for Mr. Hargrave. They have forged a letter in your hand, miss, inviting him to an exhibition of automata at Lord Whitmore's estate. They are luring him there with the promise of meeting you, of a secret rendezvous away from prying eyes." My heart stopped. "When?" I demanded, seizing her shoulders. "When is this happening?" "Tomorrow night, miss. The letter was sent this morning. Mr. Hargrave will have received it by now. He will think you have arranged a meeting, a chance for the two of you to be together. But when he arrives—" She trailed off, her face white with fear. "What?" I demanded, my fingers digging into her shoulders hard enough to leave bruises. "When he arrives? What?" "Lord Whitmore has hired men, miss. Rough men. Criminals from the London slums. They are to wait for Mr. Hargrave in the gallery where the automata are displayed. When he arrives, they will seize him and beat him, miss. Beat him badly. Lord Whitmore said he wanted Mr. Hargrave's hands broken so he could never work again, never build another of his machines. And then they will plant evidence on him, documents that make it look like he has been stealing from your father's company, sabotaging the locomotives, selling secrets to rival railways. They will hand him over to the constables with the forged evidence, and he will go to prison, miss, for years and years, and no one will believe his denials. Because who would take the word of a common mechanic over a baron and an earl's son? The world seemed to spin around me, tilting on its axis until I could no longer tell which way was up. I thought of Daniel's hands, those beautiful, gentle hands that had crafted mechanical birds and brought music out of brass and copper. I thought of those hands broken, useless, destroyed because he had dared to love me, because he had committed the unforgivable sin of looking at me as a person rather than a prize. "I cannot let this happen," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, calm and cold and utterly certain, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. "I will not let this happen." "But miss," Polly whispered, her eyes wide with terror, "how will you stop it? You cannot even leave this room. Your father has men at the door day and night. The windows are 30 feet from the ground. There is no way out." I looked at her, and something in my face must have frightened her, because she took a step back, her candle flickering. "Watch me," I said. The window of my chamber overlooked the east garden, a drop of perhaps 15 feet to the soft earth below. It was not 30 feet, as Polly had claimed, though it was still a considerable distance, enough to break an ankle or worse if one landed badly. But I had climbed down from this window once before, as a rebellious girl of 12 who had wanted to see the fireworks display in the village without her governess's supervision. I had torn my dress and scraped my knees and been confined to my room for a week when I was caught sneaking back in. But I had done it, and I would do it again. Polly helped me fashion a rope from bedsheets, knotting the fabric with fingers that trembled so badly I had to guide her hands through each twist. She brought me my simplest dress, a dark wool that would not stand out in the night, and helped me pin my hair beneath a plain bonnet that would hide its distinctive auburn color. She gave me the few coins she had saved from her wages, pressed them into my palm, with tears streaming down her face. "God go with you, miss," she whispered. "Bring him back safe." I hugged her tight, this brave girl who had risked everything to help me, and then I climbed out the window into the darkness. The sheets bit into my palms as I lowered myself hand over hand, the cold night air stinging my cheeks and stealing the breath from my lungs. The ground seemed impossibly far away, a pool of shadow beneath me that could contain anything, rocks or roots, or the broken glass of my own future. But I did not stop, did not hesitate, did not allow myself to think about what I was doing or what would happen if I failed. My feet touched earth. I crouched in the shadow of the house, listening for any sign that I had been observed. But the night was silent except for the distant hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the trees. The guards at my door had not heard. The household slept on, oblivious to my escape. I made my way to the stables, keeping to the shadows, moving with a stealth I had not known I possessed. The grooms were asleep in their quarters above the horse stalls, and I saddled my mare myself, fumbling with the straps in the darkness, biting my lip against the noise of metal and leather. She was a good horse, my Artemis, a gray mare I had ridden since she was a foal, and she seemed to sense my urgency, standing patient and still as I prepared her for the journey ahead. I led her out through the back gate, the one the groundskeeper always forgot to lock, and then I was riding through the night like a woman possessed, the wind tearing at my hair and the cold numbing my fingers and the thunder of hoofbeats drowning out the terror that clawed at my chest. Lord Whitmore's estate was 20 miles to the south, a sprawling Gothic manor called Ravenswood that had been in his family for generations. I knew the road well enough, having traveled it for countless dinner parties and social gatherings over the years, though I had never ridden it alone, in the dark, with nothing but the stars to guide me and everything I loved hanging in the balance. The miles seemed endless. My mare was strong, but she was not built for this kind of desperate flight, and I could feel her beginning to flag beneath me as the hours wore on. I pushed her as hard as I dared, whispering encouragements and promises, trying not to think about what would happen if I arrived too late, if Daniel was already in the hands of Whitmore's hired thugs, if his beautiful hands were already broken and bleeding. I would not let myself imagine that. I would not let myself consider the possibility of failure. I would reach him in time. I would save him. I would fight my way through every obstacle between us, because that was what love demanded, and because I would rather die than live in a world where Daniel Hargrave was destroyed for the crime of loving me. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east when I finally saw the gates of Ravenswood rising out of the morning mist. They were wrought iron, elaborate and imposing, twisted into the shape of ravens with spread wings, the family crest that had given the estate its name. They stood open as though expecting guests, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I left my exhausted mare at the edge of the wood, tying her to a tree with a whispered apology, and continued on foot, staying in the shadow of the ancient oaks that lined the drive. The manor itself was a hulking silhouette against the gray sky, all turrets and gargoyles and windows that watched the approaching dawn like empty eyes. Most of those windows were dark, but there was a faint glow coming from what I knew to be the gallery, a long room on the ground floor where Lord Whitmore kept his collection of art and curiosities. That was where they would be holding the exhibition. That was where Daniel would be walking into a trap. I circled around to the servants' entrance, a small door at the back of the house that I had used once before, years ago, when I had needed to escape a particularly tedious dinner party and had slipped out to smoke a cigarette in the garden with Lord Whitmore's sister, a delightfully rebellious young woman who had later scandalized her family by running off with an Italian painter. The door was unlocked, as I had hoped, and I slipped inside, finding myself in a dim corridor that smelled of cooking grease and coal smoke and the particular mustiness of an old house slowly crumbling into decay. I could hear voices somewhere ahead of me, muffled by distance and closed doors, and I followed the sound, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my hands trembling at my sides. The corridor led to a servant's staircase, and the staircase led to the main hall, and the main hall led to the gallery, and with every step I took, the voices grew louder, clearer, more distinct. I heard my father's voice, cold and commanding. I heard Lord Whitmore's, smooth and self-satisfied. I heard other voices too, rougher, cruder, the voices of men who had been paid to do violence and were waiting impatiently for their work to begin. But I did not hear Daniel, not yet. The gallery was just as I remembered it, a long, high-ceilinged room lined with paintings and display cases, filled with the accumulated treasures of generations of Whitmores. But tonight it had been transformed. Gas lamps burned at intervals along the walls, casting pools of flickering light that left deep shadows between them, giving the room an eerie theatrical quality, like a stage set for some dark drama. And in those pools of light stood the most extraordinary collection of automata I had ever seen. There were dozens of them, mechanical figures of every size and description. A brass tiger that seemed to breathe, its jeweled eyes glinting in the lamplight, its metal flanks rising and falling with simulated respiration. A woman in a ball gown who danced an endless waltz with an invisible partner, her porcelain face frozen in an expression of eternal joy. A child who sat at a miniature piano, its tiny fingers moving over the keys with uncanny precision, though no sound emerged from the instrument. There was a fortune teller in a glass booth, her mechanical hands hovering over a crystal ball. There was a magician producing endless silk scarves from his sleeve. There was a knight in armor whose sword arm rose and fell in an eternal gesture of challenge. They were beautiful and eerie and utterly mesmerizing, and I understood at once why Daniel would have been unable to resist the invitation to see them. For a man who had devoted his life to creating such marvels, who dreamed of mechanical wonders the way other men dreamed of wealth or power, this collection would have been irresistible. He would have walked into any trap, risked any danger, just to see these creations with his own eyes. But Daniel was not here. Not yet. The room was occupied by perhaps a dozen men, most of them standing in small clusters, talking in low voices, waiting. I recognized Lord Whitmore immediately, his tall figure and pale hair unmistakable even at a distance, his aristocratic bearing radiating the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He was speaking with my father. Their heads bent close together, and even from across the room I could see the satisfaction in their postures, the smugness of conspirators whose plan was about to come to fruition. And then I saw the others, 3 men standing apart from the rest, near the main entrance to the gallery, their rough clothes and brutal faces marking them as the hired thugs Polly had warned me about. They were large men, thick with muscle, their hands scarred and calloused from violence. One of them was idly cracking his knuckles, the sound echoing in the quiet room like the snapping of bones. I had arrived first. Daniel was not here yet. There was still time. But what could I do? I was one woman against a room full of men, with no weapon and no allies and no plan beyond the desperate hope that love alone would be enough to save him. I had no power here, no leverage, nothing but the force of my will and the strength of my conviction. I was still trying to think of something, anything, when I heard the sound of carriage wheels on the drive outside. Daniel was here. I did not think. I did not plan. I did not weigh the consequences or calculate the odds or allow myself even a moment of doubt. I simply moved. I stepped out of the shadows and into the light, walking toward the center of the room with my head held high and my shoulders back. Walking as I had been taught to walk in 1,000 ballrooms, with the grace and poise of a woman who belonged here, who had every right to be here, who would not be intimidated by anyone or anything. Silence fell like a curtain. Every head in the room turned toward me, and I saw shock on some faces, confusion on others, and on my father's face, a fury so intense it seemed to distort his features, to transform him into something barely human. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was barely recognizable, strangled with rage. "What in God's name are you doing here?" I ignored him. I walked past the automata with their frozen smiles and glassy eyes. I walked past the clusters of well-dressed men who stared at me as though I were an apparition, a ghost materialized from the morning mist. I walked past the hired thugs, who shifted uneasily, uncertain whether they should stop me or let me pass. I walked until I stood in the center of the gallery, directly beneath the largest of the gas lamps, where everyone could see me clearly, where there could be no mistaking who I was or why I had come. "I know what you are planning," I said, and my voice rang out strong and clear in the silent room, louder than I had expected, stronger than I had known I could be. "I know about the forged letter and the forged evidence. I know about the men you have hired to hurt him, and I am here to tell you that it ends now." Lord Whitmore stepped forward, his handsome face twisted with contempt, his pale eyes narrowing with a malice that made my skin crawl. "Miss Ashford," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with false concern, "I think you must be unwell. Perhaps the strain of recent events has affected your nerves. You really should not be here in your condition. Allow me to escort you somewhere you can rest and recover your composure. Do not touch me." The words came out sharp as a blade, and he actually flinched, his hand frozen in midair where he had reached toward me. I held his gaze without blinking, without wavering, pouring into my eyes all the contempt and disgust I felt for this man who would destroy an innocent person to feed his wounded pride. I turned to face my father, who was staring at me as though he had never seen me before, as though I were a stranger who had walked into his life wearing his daughter's face. "I know you think you are protecting me," I said, keeping my voice steady with an effort that cost me everything I had. "I know you think you are doing what is best for the family, for the Ashford name, for everything you have built. But I will not let you destroy an innocent man. Not for my sake. Not for anyone's sake. Daniel Hargrave has done nothing wrong. He has committed no crime except loving me, and I will not stand by and watch him be punished for it. Innocent?" My father laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitterness and betrayal. "That man has corrupted you, Eleanor. He has taken advantage of your innocence, your youth, your foolish romantic notions. He has ruined you, and he will pay the price for his presumption. He has done nothing but love me," I said, and my voice cracked on the words, but I forced myself to continue. "He has loved me honestly and truly, and with all his heart, which is more than anyone else in my life has ever done. More than Lord Whitmore would ever do. More than you have ever done, Father." The silence that followed was deafening. I saw something flicker in my father's eyes, something that might have been pain, might have been doubt, but it was gone so quickly I could not be sure. And then the door at the far end of the gallery opened, and Daniel walked in. He looked beautiful in the flickering gaslight, more beautiful than I had ever seen him. He was wearing his best coat, the one he reserved for special occasions, a dark wool that brought out the warmth of his eyes and the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, his boots polished to a shine I had never seen before. He had dressed for this meeting, I realized. He had dressed to see me. He had believed the letter was real, had believed I was waiting for him here, had prepared himself for a romantic rendezvous with the woman he loved. And now he was walking into a room full of his enemies, and the expression on his face as he took in the scene before him was one I knew I would remember until the day I died. "Eleanor," he said, and there was such confusion in his voice, such fear, such desperate hope. "What are you doing here?" "I received your letter. I thought we were going to." He trailed off as he realized what was happening. As he saw the hired thugs by the door, now moving to block his exit. As he saw my father and Lord Whitmore standing side by side with identical expressions of cold triumph. As he understood, with the terrible clarity of a condemned man, that he had been lured into a trap. It was a trap, I said, moving toward him, crossing the space between us as though the rest of the room did not exist. The letter was forged. I did not write it. They brought you here to destroy you, to accuse you of crimes you did not commit, to break you and imprison you, and make sure you could never work again. Daniel's eyes met mine, and I saw understanding dawn in them, followed by something that looked like grief. A grief not for himself, I realized, but for me, for what this moment was costing me, for the sacrifice I was making by being here, by standing against my own father, by choosing him over everything I had ever known. "You should not have come," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should have stayed safe at home. You should have let them do what they were going to do. I am not worth this, Eleanor. I am not worth losing everything. And let them destroy you?" I reached him and took his hands in mine, not caring who saw, not caring about the scandal or the shame or the consequences. His fingers were cold, trembling slightly, but they closed around mine with a strength that made my heart surge with hope. I would rather die than let that happen. I would rather lose everything I have than live in a world without you. "How touching," Lord Whitmore drawled, stepping forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The heiress and the mechanic, together at last. A love story for the ages. "But I am afraid your little romance has reached its end, Miss Ashford. Your father and I have an agreement. You will marry me as planned, and Mr. Hargrave here will face the consequences of his presumption. It is really very simple." "No," I said. Whitmore raised an eyebrow, a gesture of aristocratic disdain that was meant to intimidate. "I beg your pardon?" I said no. I released Daniel's hands and turned to face the room, drawing myself up to my full height, summoning every ounce of the breeding and education that had been drilled into me since childhood. "I will not marry you, Lord Whitmore, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And if you lay a single finger on Daniel Hargrave, I will make sure that every newspaper in England knows exactly what kind of man you are." A murmur ran through the assembled men, a ripple of unease that was deeply satisfying to witness. Lord Whitmore's face flushed with anger, his aristocratic composure cracking to reveal the petty, vicious creature beneath. "You would not dare," he hissed, "try me." I held his gaze without flinching, without wavering, letting him see the steel in my eyes, the absolute conviction that I would do exactly what I threatened. "I know about your debts, my lord. I know about the gambling and the creditors and the desperate measures you have taken to stave off bankruptcy. I know about the maid at your London house who disappeared so suddenly last spring, the one who was carrying your child. I know where she is now, and I know what happened to the baby. I know things about you that would destroy your reputation utterly and completely, that would make you a pariah in every drawing room in England, that would send you to prison or worse. So ask yourself, Lord Whitmore, is punishing Daniel Hargrave worth losing everything you have left?" The silence in the gallery was absolute. Lord Whitmore had gone from flushed to deathly pale, his hands trembling at his sides, his eyes wide with the dawning realization that I was not bluffing, that I had somehow acquired ammunition that could destroy him. I had not, of course. I had been guessing, extrapolating from rumors and whispers and the expressions I had seen on servants' faces over the years. But I had guessed correctly, and he knew it. And that was all that mattered. My father stepped forward, his expression thunderous. "Eleanor, that is enough. You have made your point. Now step away from that man and let us discuss this like civilized people. There is nothing to discuss." I did not move. I did not look away from my father's face. I have made my choice. I choose Daniel. I choose love. I choose a life of meaning over a life of empty luxury. And if that means losing my inheritance, if that means losing my place in society, if that means losing you, then so be it. But I will not be party to the destruction of a good man. I will not marry a monster to preserve a fortune built on the backs of workers like the one you are trying to destroy. I felt Daniel move to stand beside me, felt his hand find mine again, felt his strength flow into me like a current of electricity. Together we faced the room. Together we faced my father and Lord Whitmore and all the forces of wealth and power that sought to tear us apart. "You would throw away everything for him?" my father asked, and there was something in his voice I had never heard before. Something that might have been bewilderment, might have been the first stirrings of doubt. "Everything I have built, everything I have given you, everything you have ever known? You never gave me anything that mattered," I said, and my voice was steady, even though my heart was breaking. "You gave me a gilded cage and called it a home. You gave me silk dresses and diamond necklaces and endless empty rooms. But you never once asked me what I wanted. You never once cared about my happiness. You never once saw me as a person rather than a possession, an asset to be deployed, a piece in your endless game of wealth and power." I paused, drawing a deep breath, feeling the weight of every word I was about to speak. "Daniel Hargrave has given me something you never could, Father. He has given me his heart. He has given me respect. He has seen me, truly seen me, for who I am rather than what I can provide. And that is worth more than all the railways in England. That is worth more than all the money in the world." I turned to face the room, my hand clasped tightly in Daniel's. And I spoke the words that would change everything, the words that would define the rest of my life. "He is mine," I said, and my voice rang out clear and strong, echoing off the walls, filling the gallery with its fierce declaration. "Do you hear me? He is mine. Not because I have bought him or claimed him or demanded him as my property, but because he has given himself to me freely, as I have given myself to him. We belong to each other. And I will fight anyone, destroy anyone, sacrifice anything to keep him safe. So unless you want to see exactly how far I am willing to go, unless you want to discover just how much damage one determined woman can do to your reputations and your fortunes and your precious social standing, I suggest you let us walk out of here. Now." No one moved. No one spoke. The gas lamps flickered and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the automata stood frozen in their eternal poses, witnesses to a battle that had nothing to do with gears and springs, and everything to do with the complicated machinery of the human heart. And then, slowly, like a man waking from a dream, like a man seeing something for the first time that he should have seen all along, my father nodded. "Go," he said, and his voice was hoarse, stripped of all its usual authority, raw with something that might have been defeat, might have been something else entirely. "Go then, take your mechanic and your pride and your righteous declarations and see how far they carry you. But know this, Eleanor, the moment you walk out that door, you are no longer my daughter. You are no longer an Ashford. From this moment forward, you are nothing. You have no name, no home, no family. You are dead to me." I looked at him, this man who had been my father for 23 years, who had shaped me and molded me and tried to control me, who had loved me in his own limited way, even as he had tried to make me into something I could never be. And I felt a great sadness wash over me, a mourning for the relationship we could have had, for the understanding we had never reached. "No, Father," I said softly. "From this moment forward, I am free." I turned and walked toward the door, Daniel's hand still clasped in mine. The hired thugs parted to let us pass, their brutal faces uncertain, looking to their employers for guidance that did not come. The well-dressed men stepped aside, their expressions a mixture of shock and something that might have been grudging respect. We walked out of the gallery and through the entrance hall and out the great front doors of Ravenswood Manor into the pale light of dawn. The mist was rising from the grass, and the first birds were beginning to sing, and the world stretched out before us, vast and unknown and terrifying and beautiful. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We walked down the drive and through the gates with their wrought-iron ravens and into the wood where I had left my mare. We walked in silence, our hands clasped together, our footsteps in perfect synchrony, and I thought about everything I had just given up and everything I had just gained, and I could not make myself regret any of it. It was Daniel who finally broke the silence. "You should not have done that," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion, choked with feelings he could barely contain. "You have given up everything for me, Eleanor. Your family, your fortune, your entire future. I am not worth that. I could never be worth that." I stopped walking and turned to face him, reaching up to touch his cheek, to trace the line of his jaw, to feel the warmth of his skin beneath my fingertips. "You are worth everything," I said simply. "You are worth more than I could ever deserve, and I would do it all again, every moment of it, without a second thought." He kissed me then, there in the misty wood, with the birds singing around us and the dawn light turning everything to gold. It was a kiss unlike any we had shared before, a kiss of triumph and terror, and the fierce, desperate joy of two people who had fought against impossible odds and somehow, impossibly, won. When we finally broke apart, I looked into his eyes and saw my own future reflected there. It would not be easy, I knew. There would be struggles and hardships, poverty and uncertainty, 1,000 small defeats and occasional small victories. But it would be ours, our life, our love, our story. "What do we do now?" Daniel asked, and for the first time since I had known him, he sounded lost, uncertain, like a man who had suddenly found himself in a country whose language he did not speak. I smiled, feeling something bloom in my chest, something that felt like hope, like freedom, like the first day of a new life. "Now we begin," I said. "Together." The years that followed were not easy. I do not wish to pretend that love alone was enough to smooth away all the difficulties of our situation. Daniel and I had nothing when we walked away from Ravenswood Manor that morning, nothing but each other and the clothes on our backs and the few coins that Polly had pressed into my palm. We were strangers in a world that had been designed to exclude us, refugees from our own lives, forced to start over from nothing. We made our way to London, where Daniel found work in a small clock-making shop owned by a sympathetic German immigrant named Heinrich Müller, who recognized his talent and gave him a chance. I took in sewing and mending, the skills I had learned from watching my mother's seamstresses as a child, and I discovered that I was better at it than I had expected, that there was a satisfaction in creating something useful with my own hands that I had never known existed. We lived in a single room above a chandler's shop in Clerkenwell, a tiny space with a narrow bed and a small table and a window that looked out over the rooftops of the city. The walls were thin, and we could hear our neighbors arguing and laughing and making love, the sounds of humanity packed together in all its messy, complicated glory. The streets outside were crowded and dirty, full of vendors and beggars and children playing in the gutters, a far cry from the manicured gardens and polished halls of Ashford Hall. But we were happy. God help me. We were happier than I had ever been in all my years as an heiress. I learned to cook on a small coal stove, burning my fingers and ruining meals until I finally mastered the art of simple dishes, stews, and pies, and roasted vegetables that Daniel declared the finest food he had ever tasted. I learned to budget our meager income, to make a shilling stretch until it screamed for mercy, to find joy in small luxuries like a fresh loaf of bread or a bunch of flowers from the market. Daniel worked long hours at the clockmaker's shop, but his evenings and weekends were his own, and he spent them creating his automata. He had brought his sketches and his tools when we fled, and he set up a small workspace in the corner of our room, filling our tiny space with gears and springs and the constant soft whirring of mechanisms in progress. I would sit beside him as he worked, reading aloud from books we borrowed from the lending library, poetry and novels and scientific journals, anything that would educate and entertain us both. Sometimes he would stop working and pull me into his lap, kissing me until I forgot what I had been reading, and we would end up tangled together on the narrow bed, lost in each other, the rest of the world falling away. We were married in a small church in Islington on a rainy afternoon in June, with Heinrich Miller and his wife as our only witnesses. I wore a simple blue dress that I had made myself, and Daniel wore his best coat, and we exchanged vows that we had written together, promises of love and loyalty and partnership that would last until death parted us. It was the happiest day of my life. Daniel's automata began to attract attention. Heinrich displayed the mechanical nightingale in his shop window, and customers would stop to watch it sing, marveling at its lifelike movements, its haunting melody. Word spread through the city, and soon collectors and curiosity seekers were seeking out the young mechanic who could make metal come alive. He sold the nightingale to a wealthy merchant for £15, more money than we had ever possessed at one time, and we celebrated with a bottle of wine and a dinner at a restaurant, the first time I had eaten in a public establishment since leaving my father's house. More commissions followed: a mechanical peacock for the daughter of a baronet, a clockwork chess player for a gentleman's club in Mayfair, a trio of dancing fairies for a traveling exhibition that toured the country for 3 years, bringing Daniel's name to audiences who had never heard of him before. Within 5 years of that desperate night at Ravenswood Manor, Daniel Hargrave was no longer a poor mechanic. He was an inventor of international renown, his name spoken with reverence in scientific circles and curiosity in fashionable drawing rooms. He received offers from universities and governments, from wealthy patrons who wanted to fund his research and industrialists who wanted to exploit his genius. He turned them all down, at least the ones that would have required him to compromise his principles or abandon his independence. "We have enough," he would say, pulling me close in our flat, which had grown from a single room to a comfortable set of apartments as our fortunes improved. "We have each other. What more could we possibly need?" He was right, of course. We did have enough. We had more than enough. We had love. We had partnership. We had the profound satisfaction of having built a life together from nothing, of having defied every force that had sought to tear us apart. We had the knowledge that we had chosen each other freely, completely, without reservation or regret. But the past has a way of catching up with us, no matter how far we run. It was a spring evening in 1885, 6 years after that fateful night at Whitmore Manor, when the letter arrived. It was addressed to me in an unfamiliar hand, the script cramped and uncertain, as though written by someone whose fingers were not accustomed to holding a pen. The postmark was from the town nearest to Ashford Hall, a place I had not allowed myself to think about for years. My father was dying. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time, watching the light fade outside our window, listening to the familiar sounds of the city settling into evening. Daniel was working at his bench, as he always did at this hour, his fingers moving with their usual precision, but I could feel his eyes on me, could sense his concern. The letter was from his housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had served our family since I was a child. She wrote that my father had been ill for some months, that the doctors had done everything they could but that his heart was failing, that he had perhaps weeks to live, perhaps days. She wrote that he had asked for me, that he had spoken my name in his fever, that he seemed to be waiting for something that would not come. She wrote that she was sorry for overstepping, but that she thought I should know. "Eleanor," Daniel said, setting down his tools and coming to sit beside me. "What is it? What has happened?" I showed him the letter. I told him everything it contained, the illness, the failing heart, the summons I had not expected and did not know how to answer. And then I asked him the question that had been burning in my chest since the moment I had read those words. "Should I go to him?" I whispered, After everything he did, after everything he said, should I go? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hand holding mine, his thumb tracing slow circles on my palm. I watched his face, searching for some indication of what he was thinking, but his expression was unreadable, closed off in a way I rarely saw. "I cannot tell you what to do," he said at last, raising my hands to his lips and kissing them gently. "I cannot tell you whether to forgive him or hate him or something in between. What he did to us, what he tried to do to me, that was unforgivable by any measure. He would have destroyed my hands. He would have sent me to prison. He would have taken everything from me, including you." "I know," I said, tears beginning to slide down my cheeks. "But," Daniel continued, and his voice softened, became tender in a way that made my heart ache, "he is also your father. He is the man who raised you, who shaped you, who gave you the strength and the courage to stand up to him in that gallery and declare your love. Whatever else he was, whatever terrible things he did, he was a part of making you who you are. And I love who you are, Eleanor. I love every part of you, even the parts that came from him." He cupped my face in his hands, wiped away my tears with his thumbs, looked into my eyes with such profound love that I felt something crack open inside me, some last barrier I had not known I was holding. "I believe that you should go," he said, "not for his sake, but for yours, so that you can say goodbye, so that you can find whatever peace is possible between you, so that you can walk away knowing that you did everything you could, that you gave him every chance, that you did not let pride or anger or even justified resentment prevent you from being the person you want to be." I buried my face in his chest and wept, crying out all the fear and confusion and complicated grief that the letter had stirred up. He held me through it, stroking my hair, murmuring soft words of comfort, being everything I had ever needed, everything I would ever need, for the rest of my life. I left for Ashford Hall the next morning. The journey north was strange and dreamlike, the familiar landscape unreeling outside the train window like scenes from a half-remembered past. I had not been back to this country since that night 6 years ago, had deliberately avoided any place that might remind me of the life I had left behind. But now, as the moors and valleys and industrial towns rolled past, I found myself remembering things I had thought I had forgotten. The way the heather bloomed purple in late summer, the sound of sheep bleating on distant hillsides, the particular quality of light that fell on these northern lands, softer and more diffuse than the harsh brightness of London, filtered through layers of cloud and mist and memory. Ashford Hall itself looked smaller than I remembered, its towers and turrets less imposing against the afternoon sky. The grounds were still immaculate, the gardens still precisely maintained, but there was a subtle air of neglect about the place, a sense that the vitality had gone out of it, that it was slowly beginning to fade. The butler who met me at the door was new, a young man who did not know my face, who led me to my father's bedchamber with the detached courtesy reserved for strangers. I followed him through halls that had once been as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, past portraits of ancestors who no longer seemed to have any claim on me. Upstairs, I had climbed 1,000 times as a child. My father's room was at the end of a long corridor, a grand chamber with tall windows that looked out over the valley where his railway ran. He lay in the great four-poster bed where he had slept for 50 years, a shrunken figure beneath the heavy covers, so diminished from the powerful man I remembered that for a moment I did not recognize him. His face was gray and lined, the flesh hanging loose on bones that seemed to have collapsed inward. His hair, once thick and dark, had gone white and thin, sparse across a scalp that showed through in patches. His hands, resting on the counterpane, were spotted with age and trembling slightly, with some palsy I had never seen before. And when he opened his eyes and saw me standing in the doorway, I saw something there that I had never expected to see. I saw fear. "Eleanor," he whispered, and his voice was a thread. a ghost of the booming authority I remembered, barely audible even in the silent room. "You came." "I came," I said, and walked slowly toward the bed. Toward the man who had been my father, who had tried to destroy the man I loved, who had disowned me and cast me out and told me I was dead to him. I sat in the chair beside his bed, the chair where generations of Ashfords had sat vigil over dying patriarchs, and I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the ravages of illness to the man beneath. He was afraid, I realized. Not just of death, though surely that was part of it. He was afraid of me, afraid of what I might say, afraid of what I might not say, afraid that he would die without resolution, without reconciliation, without the forgiveness he had no right to ask for, but desperately craved nonetheless. "I am dying," he said, stating the obvious, because he did not know what else to say, because all the power and authority and command that had defined his life had been stripped away, leaving only a frightened old man in a bed that was too big for him. "I know," I said. "The letter told me." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with tears. "I was wrong," he said, and the words seemed to cost him tremendous effort, as though he were pushing them out past some obstruction in his throat, about everything, about Whitmore, about you, about that young man of yours. "His name is Daniel," I said quietly, correcting the dismissive phrase with gentle firmness. "Daniel Hargrave. And he is not just my young man. He is my husband." My father nodded slowly, accepting the correction, accepting everything it implied. "I know," he said. "I have followed your story over the years. I have read about his inventions, his success. I have seen what he has become, what you have become together. And I have thought often about what I tried to do to him and to you. I did not respond. I could not. The words were stuck in my throat, tangled up with 6 years of hurt and anger, and the stubborn, persistent love that had never quite died, no matter how hard I had tried to kill it. "I was afraid," my father said, and his voice cracked on the word, broke into something raw and vulnerable that I had never heard from him before. "I was afraid of losing you, afraid of watching you throw away everything I had built, everything I had dreamed of for you. I thought I was protecting you from your own foolishness. I thought I knew what was best, but I see now that I was only protecting myself, from admitting that you had outgrown me, from accepting that you did not need me anymore, from facing the truth that I had been so focused on building an empire that I had forgotten to build a relationship with my own daughter." I reached out and took his hand. It was cold and fragile, the hand of an old man who had once seemed so powerful, so invincible. I felt the bones beneath the skin, felt the tremor that shook his fingers, and I was struck by how small he seemed, how diminished, how human. "I always needed you," I said, and the words surprised me, rising up from some deep place I had not known existed. "I just needed you to love me more than you loved your empire. I needed you to see me as a person, not a possession. I needed you to trust me to make my own choices, even if those choices were different from what you would have chosen for me." He squeezed my fingers weakly. "Can you forgive me, Eleanor? I know I do not deserve it. I know I can never undo what I did, what I tried to do. But can you find it in your heart to forgive a foolish old man who loved you badly, but loved you nonetheless?" I looked at him, this man who had been my hero and my tormentor, my father and my enemy, and I felt something shift inside me, some old, hard knot finally beginning to loosen. The anger that I had carried for 6 years, the resentment and the bitterness and the sense of betrayal, all of it began to dissolve, to fade, to transform into something else entirely. Not because he deserved it. He did not deserve it. What he had done, what he had tried to do, was monstrous by any measure. He had conspired to destroy an innocent man. He had been willing to see Daniel beaten, imprisoned, broken beyond repair. He had cast me out of my own family without a second thought. But I could not carry the weight of that anger any longer. It had grown too heavy, and I was tired. And somewhere beneath all the hurt and the disappointment, I still loved him. He was my father. He had shaped me, and letting go of the hatred did not mean forgetting what he had done. It meant freeing myself from its grip. "I forgive you," I said, and the words were true. They surprised me with their truth. "I forgive you, Father." He smiled then, a real smile, the first genuine expression I had seen on his face since I walked into the room. And for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man he had been before the railways and the money and the endless consuming hunger for more. I saw the father who had held my hand when I was small, who had taken me to see the locomotives for the first time, who had told me that one day all of this would be mine. "Tell me about him," he said, his voice fading to a whisper. "Tell me about your Daniel. Tell me about the life you have built together." And so I did. I told him about the automata and the flat in Clerkenwell and the life we had created out of nothing but love and determination. I told him about the way Daniel still looked at me after 6 years of marriage, as though I were the most precious thing he had ever seen. I told him about our hopes and our dreams and our plans for the future, and my father listened and nodded and held my hand, and for the first time in my life, I felt that he truly understood. He died 3 days later, peacefully, in his sleep. I was holding his hand when he took his last breath, and I stayed with him for a long time afterward, watching the light change in the room, thinking about all the ways we hurt the people we love, and all the ways, sometimes, if we are very lucky, we find our way back to each other. The will was a surprise to everyone, including me. My father had left everything, the estate, the railway company, the vast fortune he had spent his life accumulating, to me. There were no conditions, no restrictions, no mention of Lord Whitmore or the disgrace I had supposedly brought upon the family name. Just a simple declaration that his daughter, Eleanor Ashford Hargrave, was his sole heir and the rightful owner of everything that bore his name. There was a letter as well, written in his own hand, trembling and unsteady, but unmistakably his. "My dearest Eleanor," it read, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you, not after what I did, not after how I treated you and the man you love. But I hope that you will accept this inheritance not as an apology, which can never be adequate, but as an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. That love is more valuable than money. That the life you built with your own hands is worth more than anything I could have given you. Use this fortune as you see fit. Build the world you want to live in, and know that in the end, despite everything, I was proud of you. Prouder than I ever found the words to say. Your father." Daniel was waiting for me at the station when I returned to London, and I fell into his arms and wept against his shoulder, overwhelmed by grief and relief and a strange, unexpected joy. "What will you do?" he asked when I finally stopped crying. "With the fortune, with the company, with all of it." I pulled back and looked at him, this man who had taught me that love was worth more than all the railways in England, and I smiled. "We," I said, correcting him gently. "What will we do?" He raised an eyebrow. "We?" I took his hands in mine, the hands that had crafted mechanical birds and brought music out of brass and copper, the hands that had held me through the darkest nights and the brightest days of our life together. "I was thinking," I said, "that the workers at Ashford Railway deserve better conditions, better pay, better treatment. I was thinking that we could build a school for their children, where they could learn to read and write and do mathematics, where they could have the education that circumstances denied them. I was thinking that we could build a hospital for their families, so that no woman would have to watch her husband die in a mine collapse without proper care, so that no child would have to lose their mother to consumption because there was no doctor within walking distance." Daniel stared at me, and I saw the wonder dawn in his eyes, the same wonder I had seen that night in the gallery when I had declared him mine. "And I was thinking," I continued, "that we could build workshops. Places where young inventors like you could learn and create without worrying about where their next meal was coming from. Places where talent could flourish regardless of birth or background. Places where the children of miners and seamstresses and factory workers could become the scientists and engineers of the future. You would do that? Daniel asked, his voice hushed with awe. You would use your inheritance to help people like me? I reached up and touched his face, tracing the familiar lines of his jaw, the curve of his mouth, the small scar above his eyebrow that he had gotten as a boy. I would do anything for people like you, I said, because I love you, because you showed me what it means to truly live, and because I believe that the best things in this world are not inherited or owned or hoarded, but shared. He kissed me then. There on the platform with the trains roaring past and the steam billowing around us and the whole of London spread out before us like a promise waiting to be kept. I am the luckiest man alive, he murmured against my lips. Yes, I agreed. You are. But then, so am I. And we walked out of the station together into the light and the noise and the beautiful chaos of a world that we would remake, together, in the image of our love. That was 40 years ago now. I am an old woman, my hair white, my hands spotted with age, my body bent by the weight of decades. Daniel passed 5 years ago, peacefully, in his sleep, his hand in mine until the very end, just as he had been by my side through everything that came before. The automata he built still stand in our home, still move and sing and dance when I wind their keys, reminders of the genius that lived in his fingers and the love that lived in his heart. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the moon shines through the windows, I wind the mechanical nightingale and listen to its song, and I can almost feel him beside me, hear his voice in my ear, telling me that I am brave and beautiful and worthy of the love I chose. I have outlived everyone from that chapter of my life. My father, who found redemption in his final days. Lord Whitmore, who drank himself to death in a gambling hall 2 years after our confrontation at Ravenswood. The hired thugs, the society matrons, the foremen and the workers, all of them gone now, their bones turned to dust, their stories forgotten by all but those who lived them. But I have not outlived the story. That, I think, is the strangest thing of all. The story persists. It is told and retold, passed down from mother to daughter, from lover to beloved. A reminder that love is not a gentle thing that arrives in drawing rooms with calling cards and chaperones. Love is a fire that starts in the grease-stained hands of a man who should never have looked at you, and it burns through silk and propriety until there is nothing left but the raw, trembling truth of what you are willing to sacrifice. I know this because I lived it. I chose it. I declared it aloud in a room full of enemies with nothing but my voice and my heart to defend me. He is mine, I said. And he was. For 40 glorious years, he was mine. Through poverty and prosperity, through struggle and triumph, through all the ordinary days and extraordinary moments that make up a life fully lived. And I was his, utterly, completely, without regret or reservation. That is the ending to my story. Not a fairy tale, perhaps. Not the kind of ending that wraps everything up neatly and pretends that love conquers all without effort or cost. There were struggles and sacrifices, tears and terrors, moments when I wondered if I had made the right choice. But when I close my eyes, I still see him. Still feel his hand in mine, still hear his voice whispering in the darkness, telling me that I was brave and beautiful and worthy of the love I had chosen. And I know, with a certainty that transcends age and loss and the long, slow dimming of memory, that I would choose it all again. Every moment, every sacrifice, every whispered I love you in the night. I would choose him again. I would choose love again. Always. Forever. Until the very last gear stops turning and the very last spring winds down and the mechanical heart of the universe finally falls silent. This is my story. This is my truth. And now, at last, it is told.